different sort of, oh, there we go. We've had a series of different webinars over the past few weeks, and hopefully people have had a chance to take advantage of those. I think some of the others have also dealt with COVID in some way or another. It's kind of hard to ignore in our sort of, in our lives. As I'm sure we've all kind of experienced in different ways, COVID has obviously affected society in many different ways. In the employment context in particular, we are getting frequent questions about some of the ins and outs. First, it was about remote work and how to, transition a workplace where people are, used to coming into the office or on site to remote working arrangements. Now, with the sort of availability of the vaccine, we're getting questions about introducing vaccine policies in the workplace. So what I'm going to try to do today is provide a high-level overview of the context in which some of these questions are arising and some of the considerations that employers will want to weigh in creating and implementing vaccine policies. So for those of you who have been to any other presentation I've done, and probably any other presentation that my colleagues have done, I always have this caveat. What I'm providing today is legal information. It is not legal advice. If you have specific questions about your workplace environment, I would need to know those details in order to provide you with an opinion. So what I'm providing today, and what my hope is that I can give you a high-level overview of some of the considerations that you'll want to bear in mind as an employer. So I thought it would be helpful, just to do a little bit of an overview of the timeline that we're looking at, because as I said, there have been so many sort of shifts in our day-to-day lives since the pandemic. And so I find it helpful to kind of think about the timeline. And also personally, I feel like ever since March 2020, I've completely lost track of how many months have gone by for a variety of reasons. So as folks probably remember, January 2020 was the first presumptive case of COVID in Canada. March 17th was when, we got that state of emergency, and when many businesses and organizations shifted to remote work. I personally remember, because my birthday is in March, that was the last, we call it the Last Supper, that I went out to, and we all sat in a restaurant, and within 2 days there was the state of emergency declared. We see a gradual shift towards opening certain businesses that are considered essential in May of 2020. Then, of course, we have the long-term care home crisis that same month. We see Toronto entering into these kind of optimistic reopening stages. So we have stage 2 in June, stage 3 in July. And of course, because the weather's nice, it's perhaps a bit less, people are able to move around more. And so outdoor gatherings, et cetera, are more of a possibility. Then unfortunately, we see the second wave of COVID in September of 2020. In October, we have the mask policies, restrictions on indoor dining. We have the closure of indoor dining, gyms, and cinemas. Also in October. November, basically a year ago, we have Toronto in the red zone because things were really getting quite a bit worse. And then in December, we have the first dose of the vaccine that's administered, and people probably remember it was the rollout was, its own sort of project. We have a province-wide shutdown just after Christmas in December 2020. In January 2021, this is the second dose of the vaccine administered. So when I'm, these references to the first and second vaccine aren't talking about, majority access or majority vaccination. It's talking about really the first time that these doses were administered. But by March, we see 1 million vaccines being administered in the province. In May, again, we're having a further kind of opening up of the demographic that has access to the vaccine. And, over the course of the past few months, we're seeing a fairly high rate of double vaccinations in the province of Ontario and in cities in particular. So part of this timeline is also obviously tracing what has happened in the workplace from the shutdown in March of 2020, where, as I said, many employers began to operate remotely. And then as we see, things opening back up again, there's sort of a tentative shift back to a physical workplace, except of course for those companies and organizations that just gave up their physical workplaces and said they're going to be remote forever. I think the majority of folks on this call are probably not in that situation, and so the physical workplace is still a reality. So when we're thinking about transitioning from remote work to in-person work, I think there are two sort of big considerations from a legal perspective. The first is the ability to ensure a safe and healthy workplace. That is an obligation of employers under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, is to ensure that there is a workplace that is, free from harassment, free from danger, free from violence, et cetera. But obviously, health and safety considerations are part of that. The second consideration is the ability to adhere to the Human Rights Code and the expectation of privacy. And we'll get a bit further into how the human rights piece fits into the vaccine policy specifically. But on a high level, these are, some of the considerations for employers as we think about a return to work. And the big question, or what I think is the big question, is whether having a mandatory vaccine policy is synonymous with protecting worker safety. That is to say, can you as an employer uphold your obligations to ensure a safe and healthy workplace if you don't have a vaccine policy in place? So I thought it might be helpful for us to kind of look broadly at what is going on in some of the other sectors, and specifically those sectors in which there is basically a legal obligation to have a vaccine policy. So these are regulated workplaces with mandatory vaccine policies. And folks may have seen as these announcements were being rolled out, some people on the call may be, you may be involved in some of these workplaces, but federally regulated workplaces, including air, rail, the transport sector, had basically a mandate to establish a mandatory vaccine policy. Hospital networks, home community care networks, the shelter system, there have been regulations that require, again, a policy to be put in place. And then you have municipalities, for example, the City of Toronto, that also have a mandate to establish a policy. But there are many workplaces that are not regulated. There isn't a specific piece of legislation or regulation you can go to that says you must have a vaccine policy in place. And so what happens for those employers who don't have the ability to say, well, we were told we had to put this in place and we did, and this is what we're relying on? Is there any guidance available to employers who are in workplaces that don't fall either within the federal, regulation or some of the other sectors that I mentioned? So while the country, province and city may not have mandated all employers to establish a vaccine policy, the guidance from the provincial regulations suggests that a vaccine policy should be given serious consideration. So in the province of Ontario, part of the sort of roadmap and one of the rules for businesses and others, is this regulation here. Ontario Regulation 36420, which basically says people responsible for a business or organization operating that is opening should be operating in compliance with any recommendations and instructions issued by the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health or by a medical officer of health after consultation with the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, requiring the business or organization to establish, implement, and ensure compliance with a COVID-19 vaccine policy, or setting out the precautions and procedures that the business or organization must include in its COVID-19 vaccination policy. So what does that mean? This means that there is a regulation which requires individuals who are operating businesses or organizations to do so in compliance with advice issued by the Chief Medical Officer. So let's see if we can get anything more there. And we can, because in August, Toronto's Chief Medical Officer of Health strongly recommended that Toronto employers institute a COVID-19 vaccination policy and support workplace vaccination. So this is what was said by Dr. Eileen Davila. Supporting your employees to get vaccinated is the best way to help protect them from the risks of COVID-19, prevent outbreaks in workplace settings, and build confidence for a safer return to work as we continue living with this virus in our community. So I've included this sort of additional piece of information because even if we are speaking about unregulated workplaces, it's my view that there is adequate guidance based on the regulation that we looked at, suggesting that if the Chief Medical Officer of Health is advising either that there should be a vaccine policy or other steps should be taken in the workplace, I think that that is adequate grounds on which to seriously consider a policy. Now, this was some additional guidance provided by the Chief Medical Officer, which is extremely helpful. These are the recommended components of a vaccine policy. So what she has said is proof of the vaccination series approved by Health Canada or the WHO. Unvaccinated employees are to provide written proof of a medical reason from a physician or nurse practitioner, including whether the reason is permanent or time limited. And don't worry, this is obviously a big topic. So I'm going to come back to this, but I just want to give you sort of the framework that's been provided for vaccine policies by the Chief Medical Officer. Unvaccinated workers to complete a vaccination education course on the risks of being unvaccinated in the workplace. And employers should be identifying how vaccination status will be collected and protected in accordance with privacy legislation and explain the level of risk posed by COVID in each unique workplace setting. So this is extremely helpful in terms of developing a framework for a vaccine policy and for sort of giving us some sense of what employers should be thinking about when they're collecting this information. So this is what I see as being some of the key takeaways from the Chief Medical Officer's guidance. Employers can encourage vaccination, which is different from mandating it, by reminding workers of sick days that are available to them in the event of side effects from the vaccine, providing paid leave to get vaccinated, providing resources related to the vaccine, and providing incentives. So again, this is encouraging vaccination. Encouraging vaccination could be in conjunction with a policy that sets out certain parameters and says, if vaccination is not complete by X date, we will take further steps. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I do want to just, again, take a step back and say that there is, in my view, these are two separate, these approaches can be combined, encouraging vaccines and having a mandatory policy. There may be workers who, or sorry, there may be employers who determine though that because of the nature of the work they're doing, because of how the remote workplace has functioned, that you don't need a mandatory vaccine policy. You may be shifting to remote working arrangements. You may have staff who, are not coming into a physical workplace, or you may also have an alternative to a mandatory vaccine, which would be submitting proof of a negative COVID test every time, entry into a physical space is required. Now, again, we can talk a little bit more about that, but I set this out to say, in my view, there is a strong recommendation and sort of push from the chief medical officer for employers to seriously consider implementing a vaccine policy. That doesn't necessarily mean that, if the circumstances of your work are such that, you don't expect there to be in-person gathering or whatever else, you're shifting to a largely remote setup, you may not need to have a mandatory vaccine policy, or you might have a vaccine policy that includes as an alternative, if staff are unvaccinated, they need to submit proof of negative tests on a regular basis. So I just set that out there as part of a framework. That said, again, most of the questions that we get are from folks that are looking to institute a mandatory vaccine policy. And so that's what I wanted to focus sort of the bulk of this presentation on. Okay. So I think one of the challenges with providing advice on the mandatory vaccine policy in the context of COVID is simply the lack of case law, because this is such a new and relatively novel situation. So there's a real lack of guidance on how a court might rule about the enforceability of a specific policy. So what a lot of the literature does is it draws from the case law that was made during the influenza vaccine kind of era when that was being introduced and rolled out. And so some of that guidance is helpful to us in determining how a court might view the reasonableness and enforceability of a vaccine policy that's established right now. So the first thing that we know from what we sort of have learned from that era of case law is that any policy has to be reasonable and proportionate. There has to be an evidentiary basis for it. So if, an employer is unable to demonstrate that the step that they're requiring employees to take is, necessary or important for health and safety purposes, then a court would probably find that we don't have the evidentiary basis. I would be comfortable saying at this point that I think there is adequate medical and sort of general knowledge of the impact of COVID vaccines on reducing the risk of transmission. And so I don't think that there is likely to be an evidentiary sort of an objection to a policy on the basis that there isn't enough evidence that vaccines are sort of, helpful. So I think that I just say that because it's part of the framework when we're thinking through a policy. Some of the other principles that we can rely on are the policy has to be reasonable and proportionate. It has to be consistent with the collective agreement or employment agreement. It has to be reasonable. It has to be clear, so clearly stated. This is an important one. It should be brought to the attention of the employees affected before the employer attempts to act on it. So I do not suggest that a policy be rolled out on a Monday and then Tuesday there are disciplinary steps for people who are not complying with the policy. There needs to be adequate time and notice given to those who may be affected by the policy. And that could mean, and what I've seen in some cases is a policy that is issued, but which takes effect in, say, a week or 2 weeks. You have to allow a grace period, and obviously you can take preventative steps during that time, say that people should not be coming into work, etc. But, it really does need to be brought to the attention of employees, and there should be adequate notice on it. It should be consistently enforced. So we don't want a situation where there's a policy, but it's being unevenly and arbitrarily applied to different members of the organization. The policy should be clearly, it should clearly specify who it applies to, and you want to take a uniform and standardized approach in enforcing it. Number 2 is the big one that, again, I think, we talked a little bit earlier about exemptions. So there are potential human rights grounds or grounds on which an individual may be unable to receive the vaccine. So under the Human Rights Code, there is an expectation of equal treatment without discrimination on the basis of certain grounds. And I've highlighted the 2 that I think are going to be the most prevalent when it comes to seeking exemptions from the vaccine, and that is disability and creed. So as I'm sure anyone who attended Celia's session or has attended any of her sessions on human rights and accommodation, as I'm sure you know, employers have a duty to accommodate individuals on the basis of these protected grounds to the point of undue hardship. What that means is you are required to make whatever accommodations may be necessary for somebody who requires those accommodations for one of the reasons stated here, to the point of undue hardship, which is measured only in terms of cost and health and safety. So, by way of an example, if you have somebody who has a medical condition that results in, a level of perhaps being an inability to focus at certain times of the day, somebody who requires a certain number of breaks throughout the day, someone who may require, an alternative work schedule. These are examples of accommodations that may be required as a result of, it's called a disability under the Human Rights Code, but a medical condition. The accommodation process, just setting aside the sort of COVID specific examples, accommodation is supposed to be a conversation really between the employer and the employee, where the employee makes a request for accommodation. The employer asks for information they might need in order to grant the request or to investigate it. And then the employer would propose an accommodation based on what the employee has provided. It's important to note that an employee does not have a standalone or unilateral right to demand a preferred accommodation. So, for instance, somebody suffers from a medical condition, as I said, that might, mean that they require frequent breaks or need certain types of accommodation through the day. The employee can't demand that, they want, I don't know, something that's sort of outside the scope of what the employer is able to provide, and which does not necessarily speak to their specific needs. So the employee can't demand a preferred accommodation. Accommodation does not have to be perfect. It simply needs to be reasonable and responsive to the needs of the employee. So in the case of the vaccine, this means that employers who have a vaccine policy that requires their staff to be vaccinated and to present, you'll remember that we saw, I don't want to go too quickly through these, but you'll remember one of the components of the recommended vaccine policy is proof of a vaccination series. You may have individuals who are unable to be vaccinated because of a medical condition. And what we're seeing is that as an employer, you are entitled to ask for a note from their medical advisor or healthcare practitioner, which confirms that A, they are unable to become vaccinated on account of a medical condition or disability. And B, confirming whether the inability to be vaccinated is a permanent status or state or a temporary one. Now that's important because you may have situations where somebody is temporarily unable to become vaccinated, but their healthcare practitioner might say, you know what, this is time limited. This is 3 months. This is 6 months. And as an employer, you would be entitled in those cases to then follow up after that period to say, what's going on with the status of the vaccine. So you are entitled to ask for this information. And one thing I just want to flag here, because I see this at times with clients, is getting inadequate medical notes, where you have a note that just says, very little, that might just say so-and-so can't get the vaccine. And so in those cases, you are entitled to ask for a follow-up confirmation of whether that is on the basis of a medical condition or disability, and whether that is a permanent, state of affairs that somebody cannot become vaccinated. One thing I will say is that where an employer is asking for a medical note, there is an obligation to pay the reasonable costs of obtaining that for the employee upon proof of expenditure. So you should keep that in mind when asking for further information, that you'll want to advise your staff that you'll reimburse them for those costs. But this is sort of the proof that you can ask for from staff who are claiming an exemption. So one thing that's helpful to bear in mind is that the Ministry of Health and the CP, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, have confirmed that there are very few conditions for which the risk of a vaccine outweighs the benefit. And they've really identified only 2 conditions: an allergy to a component of a vaccine to be confirmed by an immunologist or allergist, or these specific heart conditions. And so again, as an employer, you are typically not entitled to know the condition that somebody is suffering from, but you may be able to pose the question, of asking that the physician confirm that the inability to receive the vaccine, it's been assessed that the risk outweighs the benefit. Because again, increasingly, there's a sense that in most cases, getting the vaccine is going to be provide greater protection and benefit than not getting it. And so again, one of the challenges we have here is the lack of case law dealing specifically with this issue. But I expect that in the coming months, we may see situations where the Human Rights Tribunal is making a decision about what a valid exemption is, for conditions that are not an allergy or these heart conditions, can somebody claim an exemption within the meaning of the code? I would think that they would need to potentially call their doctor or specialist as a witness. And then we get into this whole world of medical literature and the question of, again, what are the specific conditions that can be said to be, in which it can be said to be inadvisable for somebody to get the vaccine. Now, the only other ground of the Human Rights Code that I think may be triggered under a vaccine policy, because if we look at these other, the other grounds, the only ones that I think are going to be relevant here are disability and creed. Now, creed is, it's interesting that the code uses the term creed, because there's not infrequent sort of questions about what exactly creed encompasses. Creed is intended to refer to religious and non-religious belief systems that are integrally linked to one's identity. So the belief has to be sincerely held. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religion. So we can see that creed would be more expansive than that. And just by way of an example, there's at least one case confirming that veganism, it was viewed as a creed within the meaning of the Human Rights Code. But what's important is that creed does not encompass individually held beliefs or preferences. So somebody saying that they do not want to get the vaccine, or they have a personal belief that it is going to cause, whatever side effects or, affect their lives in a particular way, that is not viewed as creed within the meaning of the Human Rights Code. And so it would not be a valid exemption. So it is important to keep in mind that, creed is really, it's viewed as a system of beliefs, and it is, the decisions are quite clear that someone's individual preferences and beliefs is not that doesn't qualify within this particular ground. So then we get to the interesting question of what, in the case of a medical exemption, you can ask for proof from a physician or a practitioner, and get a medical opinion. What are we looking at in terms of proof for, within the meaning of creed? There's some sort of thinking that a document from a religious leader or, somebody who is sort of the head of whatever community or belief system you subscribe to, there's some sort of literature sort of saying that that would be the logical next step in terms of seeking proof when it comes to creed. There may also be an ability to ask for, if there are sort of documents within that particular religious or thought tradition that address specifically the inability of members of that community to become vaccinated, that might be something else that you could ask for. But this one is a bit dicier. It's a bit less clear than in the medical case. But again, I do, I want to repeat though, that an individual belief is not creed in the meaning of the Human Rights Code. I would think of creed as being more expansive than religious belief in that it can include non-religious beliefs, but it really is a system of thinking that orders a person's life. So when we talk, for example, about veganism or some philosophy, that does fall within the meaning of creed, whereas somebody's personal belief about the vaccine is not going to be sufficient for a human rights exemption. Once you have a valid exemption in place, you have a duty to accommodate, again, to the point of undue hardship. So what does that look like? Undue hardship is measured based on cost and health and safety. So you could consider paying for periodic testing for somebody who has a valid exemption within the meaning of the code. You could consider permitting remote work if you're, if you are in a line of work that permits that. And of course you could, and it's advisable to maintain all of the existing precautions that are advised. So masking, social distancing, all the rest of it. But once you have a valid exemption under the code, then as an employer, you need to determine what accommodations you can offer. And so by way of an example, firing someone who has a valid exemption within the meaning of the Human Rights Code is likely going to be viewed as discrimination because you have failed to discharge the duty to accommodate them. Okay, the third big piece that was also addressed in the chief medical officer's sort of guidance is getting protections in place to ensure that privacy is not breached. So again, it is extremely important. Vaccine status is personal information, it's personal health information. And as an employer, you you need to take adequate precautions with respect to storing that information and limiting any sharing of it or disclosure without the consent of the employee. Now, I think, again, just as, when we're talking about what's reasonable and proportionate and what evidence is there with respect to the vaccine, I think there is an ability for the employer, if there is ever a complaint made under the privacy legislation by an employee who says, my employer is making me provide this information, I think that you would be able to demonstrate that the information is required for a reasonable purpose. But the next step is, how is that information being protected, and how is the risk of dissemination being limited? So these are some of the questions that I encourage you to ask. Who is collecting the information? Is it going to be depending on the context, are we talking about an executive director? Is it going to be the president of the board? How is the information being collected? You ideally would either want somebody who is in a role that is, they're the privacy officer, or they're somebody who has a direct link to that, or somebody who's in a fairly high or senior position where they can protect that information, and the risk is limited, the risk of sort of it being shared. Do you want that person, if they're an employee or whatever else, do you want them to sign some agreement confirming, you're going to receive confidential information, you will not at any time discuss or disclose it? That might be a wise thing to do. Where is this information being stored? Are you going to have physical copies? Are you going to, is it going to be stored online? Do you have password protected systems to ensure that it doesn't inadvertently get breached? Circumstances of disclosure, who can receive that information? Now, one sort of related issue that came up a lot during COVID, largely in the housing context, was the sort of COVID outbreaks and, somebody testing positive. And then there's this question of what can we do? What can we say and what can't we say? In virtually all cases, you cannot, without the consent of the party, disclose personal information, which would include their vaccine status, or, in the case of the outbreak example I gave, or that information. You can still obviously be encouraging people to take precautions, but you will almost always need consent to disclose information, unless it's compelled by law, or, you have the public health officials demanding to know certain things. And even then, it's worth looking to make sure that you're not running afoul of any of the privacy rules. How will you dispose of the information? How long will you keep it? So if you have information about employees who stop working with the organization, are you going to hold on to their vaccine status? Probably not. That kind of, these are some of the high level considerations when we're talking about protecting confidential information. Now, I'd mentioned this earlier, the timeline for implementing a policy. You don't want a situation where, you roll something out and the next day, you're sort of either dismissing people or disciplining them or anything else. There may be a risk of an argument by a staff member that this is a form of constructive dismissal if they are literally being told something one day and there's no time for implementation. So to the extent possible, I really do suggest giving ample notice. If you are requiring testing, for staff coming into the office who are unvaccinated, you could consider paying for those tests for a period of time to avoid, again, an argument that they were, suddenly they were forced to do something and they had no time to, to take care of whatever it was. It's wise to have a timeline for implementation. That's not to say that you can't still, take steps to protect health and safety. It might mean, again, encouraging remote work until the policy comes into place. It might mean you could be asking for proof of tests. You could, continue with all of the existing public health mandates around distancing and masks. Those are all possibilities. Now, the big question that, I expect many of you have, and a question that we are getting is, what happens if you have staff who are refusing to comply with a vaccine policy for reasons that are not linked to the Human Rights Code? Again, there is a real sort of gap in the case law on this specific issue because, this is fairly new. But for the most part, a policy that's reasonable, that's clearly communicated, and that's fair will be upheld. That does not mean, though, that it is advisable to terminate for cause. In fact, until we have more guidance and direction, I would not suggest terminating for cause. If there's a breach of the policy, you could certainly give a warning. But if you are in a situation of potentially terminating employment, the safest way to do that is always without cause. And because the implications, obviously, for termination without cause are that you would have to give notice or pay in lieu of notice. Whereas in a for cause termination, you don't give anything. It goes on the individual's record of employment that they were terminated for cause, so they lose access to EI. It's a quite punitive measure, and the courts are very, they frequently look for adequate grounds. And so if there is a situation of non-compliance, I would also recommend trying to work with the employee to determine if there is some interim workable solution, whether it's continuing remote work for a period of time to allow them to potentially become vaccinated and provide proof of the vaccine. I would suggest trying to work through those things before terminating for cause in particular, because that can be quite a, that's viewed as being quite a punitive step by the courts. All right, well, that was, I did not expect to have so much time for questions, but here we are. And I do see that there are some questions in the chat. All right, so one question that I have gotten here is, can you speak to what extent a mandatory vaccine policy can be applied to members of an organization's board of directors? That is an interesting question. Assuming an unregulated workplace. So, I mean, if we're talking about a volunteer board that's made up of, if we're, sort of saying, for example, in the context of a nonprofit, I mean, you could, provided that the policy is passed in accordance with the organization's procedures, which I think would be the board has to approve them. It would form part of the governance documents, et cetera. That's certainly something you could do. The situation is much more fraught in the workplace because there are implications to, for example, allegations of discrimination. And again, the Human Rights Code applies to the workplace, the provision of services, and housing and accommodation. It doesn't apply to a volunteer board of directors. So we don't have the human rights issue, at least to the same degree. We don't have the issue of termination, where, if somebody is removed from a board of directors, they might have some procedural kind of, pushback that they can use, but it's not the same as an employee losing their job and then pursuing a wrongful dismissal claim. But I guess to respond to your question, if there is, to the extent to which the board passes policies that govern the board, I don't see why you couldn't have a corporate policy that is properly introduced and approved, and you have quorum and you have all the rest of it. I don't see any reason that you couldn't have that. I do think it's worth considering how necessary, what the goal of the policy is. So if you anticipate, for example, meetings in person, gatherings, whatever else, then I totally, I get it. I think that makes good sense. I know, for myself and organizations that I've been involved with, our boards have pretty much gone remote. So, there would be a kind of question of the utility of or necessity for such a policy. But again, I don't see any issue with doing that. Okay. For new employees, can we include in postings for job openings that applicants must be vaccinated, especially if the majority of our housing members are seniors? Would this be considered discriminatory? That's a great question. So we have gotten this question. I am seeing increasingly a statement in job applications or postings that say we require vaccination as a condition of this role because of and particularly given what you said about the demographic, I think that it would be quite justified to say, it is a requirement of the role because of the nature of the population you're serving. I'm trying to think, if you had to accommodate somebody on the basis of a protected ground, would you be able to do that in a way that doesn't compromise the health and safety of those in the building? So that's kind of the tension there. But I don't see an issue with stating that we require vaccination as a condition of employment. It should be stated up front. The thing that I don't recommend, and I've had this question recently quite a bit, is collecting proof of vaccines from candidates to a job. I think, something like successful candidates will be asked to provide proof of vaccination is much better, because you don't want to be sitting on, an abundance of personal information that you then are a custodian of and could be at risk of inadvertently disclosing. So that's my response there. If you have multiple work sites, is it permissible to have different rules for work sites in Toronto versus those in North Bay, as there are differing public health recommendations? That's a good question. I would need to know more about the organization and what it's sort of like, whether it is in the practice of having different sets of policies for different workplaces. But just looking at what you've sort of said here, I think following the public health recommendation in a given jurisdiction makes sense. And I think it is reasonable to have a policy, because there are regions that are sort of in different places of the when it comes to the pandemic and are approaching matters a bit differently. Maybe you have an overarching policy that says we have separate health and safety or vaccine policies per jurisdiction, and then you have a separate policy for each of those places. I think that's permissible. I don't see any issue there. All right, well, I think I've gone through the questions and the chats. So thank you everyone for joining. I hope that was helpful. And again, if there are, as I said, this is sort of a high level overview, and it's intended to just, be information that's hopefully useful to you. If you have questions that are specific to your workplace or organization with respect to the vaccine policy, then feel free to reach out to me via email or to someone at our firm. We are doing quite a bit of this work on policies now, so we're happy to assist. So thank you everyone. And Fraser, I guess that means we can stop recording.